The silence in the boardroom didn't smell like failure. It smelled like expensive espresso and cold, sterilized ambition. I sat at the mahogany table, watching the ink dry on the contract that signed away 10 years of my life. My biotech company, my research, my chaotic, beautiful mess of a lab, all of it now belonged to Jane. The deal was simple on paper, but suffocating in practice. I had to stay. 6 months. 6 months to oversee the transition of my life's work into her corporate machine. It wasn't just business anymore. It was a collision of two opposing forces trapped in a confined space. And when I finally looked up, meeting her eyes across the glass table, I didn't see a victor. I saw something unflinching, dangerous, and terrifyingly familiar. Jane's headquarters felt less like an office and more like a fortress designed to withstand a siege. Walking into the lobby of Sterling Corp was an assault of steel, chrome, and aggressive transparency. My own labs were cluttered, organic spaces, piles of notebooks, coffee rings on safety protocols, the hum of incubators that felt like a heartbeat. Here, the air was filtered to a terrifying purity. It was quiet. The kind of quiet that costs billions of dollars. I was the captive expert, the messy scientist brought in to teach the conqueror how to use her new weapon. When I entered her office on the 45th floor, Jane didn't stand up. She sat behind a desk that looked like a slab of black ice, reviewing my gene editing data with a red pen in hand. She looked up, her expression unreadable, calm and terrifyingly efficient. "You're late," she said, not as an accusation, but as a data point. I sat down without being asked. "Traffic," I lied. She didn't blink. She just slid a folder across the ice. "Your stabilization rates are impressive, Aspen. But your methodology is romantic." That was the first cut. She didn't attack the science. She attacked the soul of it. For the next hour, she dissected my research with brutal accuracy. I expected a corporate raider, someone who cared about margins and stock prices. Instead, I found myself arguing with a mind that understood the molecular structures better than my own investors. She pointed out a flaw in the replication sequence that I had spent months trying to hide. She found it in minutes. The only sound in the room was the rhythmic, sharp click of her pen and the low hum of the air conditioning that kept the room at a precise, preservationist chill. The air smelled faintly of antiseptic and a perfume that was subtle but expensive. Sandalwood and something colder, like rain on pavement. I watched her hands. They were steady, precise, moving through the pages with a surgeon's economy of motion. It hit me then. Jane wasn't just a CEO. She was a scientist who had sold her soul for scale. She had traded the messy pursuit of discovery for the clean lines of control. "You're treating the samples like children," she said, circling a paragraph in red. "You're nurturing them when you should be stressing them. Efficiency requires pressure, Aspen." "It requires patience," I countered, my voice tighter than I wanted it to be. "You can't force evolution on a quarterly schedule." Jane stopped writing. She looked at me, really looked at me, with eyes that were a startling, clear gray. "I can force anything I own," she said softly. "And now, I own this." The friction wasn't just professional. It was elemental. She was ice, structure, and inevitable outcomes. I was heat, chaos, and possibility. She dismissed my emotional attachment to the data as a liability, demanding raw efficiency that stripped the humanity out of the cure we were building. I stood up, my chair scraping loudly against the floor, a jagged noise in her perfect room. "You bought the patent, Jane. You didn't buy the instinct." "Instinct is just unverified data," she replied, not even looking up as she returned to her papers. "Verify it or discard it." I left her office furious, my blood humming with the adrenaline of the fight. But as the elevator doors slid shut, sealing me in the silence of the descent, I realized my hands were shaking. Not from fear, and not entirely from anger. The air in that small metal box felt heavy, thick with a strange, lingering charge that had nothing to do with business. I hated her precision. I hated her coldness. But for the first time in years, someone had seen the work, really seen it, and challenged me to defend it. The descent felt like falling, and I was already bracing for impact. The board called it accelerated integration. I called it house arrest. To expedite the merger of our proprietary gene editing tech with their scaling infrastructure, the directors decided that emails and weekly briefings were insufficient. They demanded synergy. They demanded proximity. And so, 3 days after I signed away my company, I was moved out of the transition suite and directly into Jane's office. It wasn't just a workspace. It was a containment unit built of soundproof glass and high-altitude silence. We were two apex predators locked in a transparent cage, forced to breathe the same recycled, expensive air for 10 hours a day. The daily routine quickly devolved into a torturous dance of avoidance and hyper-awareness. I learned the rhythm of her existence better than I knew my own data. I knew that at 10 a.m., she drank exactly 4 ounces of sparkling water. I knew that when she was frustrated, she didn't sigh. She simply stopped typing, her stillness becoming louder than any noise. Every movement she made was calculated, precise, and distracting. I found myself tracking her reflection in the dark glass of the window, watching the sharp line of her jaw as she read reports, feeling the weight of her presence pressing against the back of my neck, even when I wasn't looking at her. It happened on a Tuesday, under the harsh wash of the afternoon sun. We both reached for the central tablet simultaneously to check a notification from the lab. It was a mundane, thoughtless action, the kind of muscle memory that happens a dozen times a day in any office. But when our hands brushed, the reaction was immediate and physical. A static shock snapped between us, sharp, audible, and stinging. It was literal electricity, generated by the dry, conditioned air and the friction of the carpet. But it felt like a warning shot. I jerked my hand back, expecting her to do the same, to retreat into her fortress of professionalism. But Jane didn't pull away. That was the terrifying part. She froze, her hand hovering just inches from where mine had been, her fingers slightly curled. She looked up, and for the first time, the gray of her eyes wasn't cold. It was heated, molten silver. She held my gaze for a fraction of a second too long. It was a pause that lasted a lifetime, a microscopic breach in the hull of her composure where I saw something raw. She wasn't just annoyed by my presence, she was affected by it. Then, as quickly as it opened, the breach sealed. She cleared her throat, tapped the screen with practiced indifference, and the moment vanished into the ether. But the air in the room had changed. The silence wasn't empty anymore. It was heavy, charged with the static that still tingled in my fingertips. The dialogue between us shifted. The hostility didn't disappear, but it transformed into something teasingly intellectual. We stopped arguing about logistics and started challenging each other's theories. I would push a radical hypothesis about RNA stability, and instead of shutting it down, she would lean forward, her eyes narrowing, and dismantle it with a brilliance that forced me to be sharper. We were sparring. It was a game of mental chess played on the edge of a cliff. By the time the cleaning crew arrived to empty the bins, the city outside had turned to a grid of amber lights. The overhead fluorescents flickered off, leaving us in the intimate glow of desk lamps and humming servers. The office became a private world, isolated high above the street, filled with the soft whir of hard drives and the unspoken, heavy tension of two women realizing they were the only people on Earth who understood each other. Late nights ceased to be overtime. They became our new geography. The building emptied out around 7, the cleaning crews came and went by 9, and by 10, the 45th floor was a silent island floating above the electric grid of the city. There is a specific kind of intimacy that forms in the vacuum of a corporate high-rise after midnight. The professional armor feels heavy, the buttons on the collars feel too tight, and the silence demands to be filled. We were isolated in the sky, bound together by a deadline that felt less like a business goal and more like a mutual sentence. We started ordering dinner in. That was the first crack in the wall. There is something strangely domestic about eating takeout cartons amidst millions of dollars of sensitive equipment. Seeing Jane Sterling, the woman who could tank a stock price with a raised eyebrow, sitting cross-legged on her ergonomic chair, expertly navigating noodles with chopsticks, felt illicit. The smell of lemongrass and chili oil replaced the scent of ozone and ambition. For 20 minutes a night, the war paused. We were just two tired women fueling our bodies against the exhaustion. It was during one of these late hours that the simulation failed. We had been running a projection on the enzyme stability for 6 hours, watching the progress bar crawl. At 98%, the screen flashed red. Failed. Data corrupted. The room plunged into the crimson warning light. I expected Jane to snap. I expected the lecture on efficiency, the cold dissection of my failure. Instead, she just closed her eyes. She took off her glasses, something I had never seen her do, and rubbed the bridge of her nose, revealing a tired woman carrying the weight of a board that wanted blood. "They're going to kill the funding if we miss this window," she whispered. It wasn't a threat. It was a confession. She looked at me. "I don't push you because I enjoy it, Aspen. I push you because they are waiting for us to fail, and I have never failed." I saw the exhaustion etched into the corners of her eyes, the sheer, crushing pressure of being the woman who never misses. The urge to comfort her rose in my chest, a warm wave battling against my resentment. I looked away, toward the floor-to-ceiling window. The office was dark behind us, lit only by the red glow of the failed monitor and the city lights below. In the glass, our reflections were superimposed over the skyline. Two silhouettes, dark and indistinct, merging together against the backdrop of the sleeping world. In the reflection, we weren't rivals. We were just two shadows, leaning toward each other, blurring at the edges. "You see patterns I don't," Jane said, her voice cutting through the red gloom. I turned back. She was watching me with an intensity that made the air feel thin. "I see the structure, the architecture of the data, but you—" She paused, studying me like I was the anomaly in her code. "You see the narrative. You treat the genome like a story that wants to be told. It's chaotic. It's messy." She leaned forward, the distance between us shrinking until I could smell the rain scent of her perfume again. "And it is absolutely brilliant. I have the capital, Aspen, but you have the mind. And frankly, yours is the more dangerous asset." The praise landed heavier and hotter than any physical compliment could have. She wasn't admiring my eyes. She was undressing my intellect. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full of things we were terrified to say. Geneva didn't care about our internal war. The city was a neutral zone of gray water, ancient stone, and expensive discretion. We were there for the Global Biotech Summit, a high-stakes masquerade where scientists pretended to be business people and business people pretended to care about science. It was neutral ground, and stepping out of the plane felt like stepping out of the ring. The boundaries that defined us in the office, the glass walls, the separate sides of the desk, the hierarchy of conqueror and captive, didn't exist here. In the thin Swiss air, the professional armor felt heavy, archaic, and suddenly unnecessary. We stayed at the Hotel Beau Rivage. The lobby smelled of old money, beeswax, and fresh lilies. It was a world away from the sterile, recycled oxygen of the 45th floor. Here, the lighting was designed to flatter, not to illuminate flaws. We met in the hotel bar after the first day of panels. It was a cavern of velvet and low light, filled with the soft, erratic rhythm of live jazz and the polite clinking of crystal. Jane arrived 10 minutes after me. She wasn't wearing the sharp, weaponized suits she wore to the office. She wore midnight blue silk that moved like water against her skin, softening the hard lines I had memorized. When she sat next to me, the air shifted. The distance between us on the velvet banquette was professional, but the tension was entirely personal. "They're afraid of the data," she said, skipping the pleasantries. She ordered a dry martini without looking at the menu. "I saw the way the Pfizer reps looked at your presentation. They're terrified." "Good," I replied, swirling the ice in my whiskey. "Fear makes people honest." "No," Jane corrected, her voice dropping an octave to cut through the saxophone. "Fear makes people dangerous. Watch your back, Aspen." Before I could answer, a shadow fell over our table. It was Marcus Thorne, a venture capitalist who had tried to buy my company 3 years ago for pennies on the dollar. He looked at Jane, then at me, and his smile was oily and knowing. "Well, well," he murmured, leaning too close. "I heard about the acquisition, but I didn't realize it was a merger of hearts. You two look formidable together." He mistook us for a couple. It was an assumption born of the low light and the undeniable gravity that seemed to pull our bodies toward each other. I opened my mouth to correct him, to clarify that I was an employee, a hostage to a contract. But Jane beat me to it. She didn't correct him. She simply leaned back, took a slow sip of her drink, and let a small, proprietary smile touch her lips. "We are formidable, Marcus," she said, her voice smooth as the silk she wore. "And we're busy." She didn't deny it. The thrill of the lie pulsed between us, a sudden conspiratorial secret that aligned us against the room. Thorne retreated, unsettled by the united front. When he was gone, I looked at Jane. She didn't apologize. She simply took a sip of her drink, the set of her shoulders daring me to contradict her. And for a moment, the lie felt truer than the contract. The ride up to the penthouse suites was a lesson in suffocation. The elevator was a gilded cage of brass and mirrors, humming softly as it ascended. We were alone. The hum of the lift masked the sound of my accelerated breathing, but it couldn't hide the reflection in the doors. We stood side by side, not touching, yet the proximity was overwhelming. The air in the small box felt thin, consumed by the heat radiating off her. I watched her reflection watch mine. The numbers on the display climbed. Floor 3, 4, 5, each ding a countdown to the moment we would have to part. Suddenly, Jane moved. She turned toward me, closing the small gap. The movement was sharp, decisive. My heart hammered against my ribs. She stepped into my personal space, crowding me against the brass rail. The scent of her, rain, sandalwood, and now the faint warmth of gin, filled my senses. She leaned in, her face inches from mine. I stopped breathing. My hands twitched at my sides, wanting to reach out, wanting to bridge the final inch. I thought she was going to kiss me. God help me, I wanted her to. She tilted her head, her lips brushing the shell of my ear, sending a shiver violently down my spine. "Thorne is shorting the stock," she whispered, her breath hot and damp against my skin, destroying my composure with surgical precision. Destroy him in the morning session. Use the raw data. It wasn't a kiss. It was a command, wrapped in intimacy. She pulled back just as the doors dinged open on the top floor. She looked at me, her eyes dark, dilated, unreadable. "Good night, Aspen," she said, her voice entirely steady. She walked out, her silk dress whispering against the carpet. The doors began to close, but I stood frozen in the empty car. The hallway she left behind felt charged, a magnetic field vibrating with the energy of what hadn't happened. I touched my ear where her breath still lingered, realizing with sharp clarity that the deal wasn't the only thing being negotiated. In the silence of the hotel corridor, the war had ended, and something far more dangerous had begun. Back in the lab, the tension from Geneva didn't dissipate. It translated into a frantic, relentless work energy. The silence of the 45th floor was no longer the silence of a cage, but the silence of a pressure cooker, waiting to blow. We moved around the equipment like binary stars, orbiting a center of gravity that was becoming impossible to ignore. We weren't just colleagues anymore. We were conspirators, bound by the secret of what almost happened in that elevator. We lived in the blue light of the monitors and the low, rhythmic hum of the gene sequencers. Every time I looked up, Jane was there. Sleeves rolled up to her elbows, hair slightly undone, eyes tracking the data with a hunger that mirrored my own. We were chasing the ghost in the machine, the flaw in the stabilization formula that stood between us and the exit. It happened at 3:14 a.m. on a Thursday. The city below us was dead, a grid of black and amber, but in the lab, the air was vibrating. I was staring at the monitor, my eyes burning from exhaustion, when the simulation bar hit 100% and stayed green. Stable. The protein didn't degrade. The sequence held. It was perfect. It was the cure. "Jane," I whispered. It was barely a sound, but she heard the change in my breathing. She was at my side in 2 seconds. We watched the screen together, the green light washing over our faces. The rush that hit me wasn't just relief. It was a high more potent than any adrenaline. It was the vindication of a lifetime of work, validated by the one person who had been ruthless enough to demand it. "We did it," she said. Her voice wasn't the cool, corporate contralto I was used to. It was breathless, cracked with awe. I turned to her. The joy was visceral, overriding the logic, overriding the contract, overriding the history of hostile takeovers and bruised egos. I didn't think. I just moved. I grabbed her shoulders, and she didn't stiffen. She stepped into me. We collided in a hug that was less about affection and more about the sheer kinetic release of energy. Her arms went around my waist, pulling me flush against her. It should have been a quick, professional embrace, a good job, team moment. It wasn't. It lasted. 1 second, 2, 5. The hum of the servers faded into the background, replaced by the thudding of my own heart against my ribs, echoing the beat I could feel in her chest. She felt solid, real, warm. The warmth of her skin seeped through my shirt, mixed with the faint metallic tang of the lab's recycled air. It was intoxicating. It smelled like victory. We pulled back, but we didn't let go. My hands were still gripping her shoulders. Her hands were still resting firmly on my waist, her thumbs pressing into the fabric of my shirt. We were inches apart, sharing the same recycled air. The look in her eyes stripped me bare. The corporate pretense was gone. The CEO was gone. There was just Jane. Her pupils were blown wide, swallowing the gray, dark with a hunger that had nothing to do with market shares. Aspen, she breathed. My name sounded different in her mouth now. It wasn't a label. It was a question. In that suspended moment, the truth hit me with the force of a physical blow. I wasn't fighting for the company anymore. I wasn't fighting for my legacy. I was fighting to stay here, in this room, with her. I had hated her for stealing my work, but somewhere in the late nights and the shared silence, I had become addicted to the thief. Her gaze dropped to my lips. The air between us crackled, heavy and hot. She leaned in, just a fraction. I could feel the heat radiating off her skin. This was it. The breach was open. Then a sound shattered the world. The phone on the desk, the secure line, the red light. It rang, shrill and demanding, cutting through the intimacy like a serrated knife. It was the chairman of the board. The red light on the secure line blinked out, leaving a silence in the room that was heavier than the one before, but infinitely colder. The warmth of our near collision evaporated, replaced by the frigid reality of the speakerphone. The chairman hadn't congratulated us. He hadn't asked about the stabilization rates or the breakthrough that would change genetic medicine forever. He had asked about the timeline. And when Jane gave him the truth, that we needed 6 months for phase 3 safety trials, he had given her an order that sounded like a death sentence for everything we had just built. Monetize it, he had said, his voice tinny and distorted. Skip phase 3. Market it as a compassionate use therapy. We launch in 4 weeks. I stood frozen near the monitors, the green, stable light still glowing behind me like a mockery. I waited for Jane to fight. I waited for the scientist I had seen in the elevator, the woman who understood the narrative of the genome, to tell him that cutting safety trials was reckless, dangerous, and unethical. I waited for her to defend the work. Instead, Jane walked behind her desk. She put the physical barrier of the black glass between us again. She picked up her pen, and when she looked at me, the molten silver was gone, replaced by the flat, impenetrable gray of the CEO who had hostilely taken over my life. We proceed as directed, she said. Her voice was steady, but I saw her knuckles. They were white, gripping the edge of the desk so hard the skin looked like parchment. You can't be serious, I said, my voice low, dangerous. That formula is stable in a simulation. In a human body, without the trial data, it could cause a cytokine storm. It could kill people, Jane. It could save the company, she countered, though the words sounded rehearsed, hollow. The stock is plummeting, Aspen. If we don't announce a product launch this quarter, the board dissolves the division. The tech gets sold for parts. The cure dies anyway. So you poison it to save it? I walked up to the desk, placing my hands flat on the cold surface, leaning in until I forced her to look at me. You're not a scientist anymore. You're just a suit. You're exactly what I thought you were when I walked in here. That hit her. I saw the flinch, microscopic but real, around her eyes. She stood up, trying to regain the height advantage. trying to be the architect again. I am doing what is necessary, she snapped. But her voice lacked its usual steel. It wavered. I am responsible for 5,000 employees. I am responsible for the legacy of this firm. I don't have the luxury of your moral purity, Aspen. I have to make the hard choice. This isn't a hard choice, I spat back. It's a wrong choice. The betrayal tasted like ash. It wasn't just professional indignation. If this had happened a month ago, I would have expected it. I would have hated her, but I wouldn't have felt this twisting knife in my gut. This hurt because I had seen her. I had seen the woman who ate noodles on the floor, the woman who whispered warnings in elevators, the woman who had almost kissed me 5 minutes ago. I had trusted her, not with my company, but with something far more fragile. I had trusted her with the truth of who we were. I won't do it, I said, stepping back. I won't sign off on the safety protocols. And if you launch, I'll leak the simulation risks to the FDA. I will burn this entire merger to the ground before I let you hurt a single patient. Jane went still. That would destroy your career. You'd be unhireable. I don't care, I said. And I meant it. I walked to the corner of the room where my personal effects were gathered. I grabbed a cardboard box. The sound of me unfolding it was loud, violent in the quiet room. I started sweeping my notebooks into it, the chaotic, messy, brilliant work she had claimed to admire. I didn't look at her. I couldn't. If I looked at her, I might scream, or I might cry, and I refused to give her either satisfaction. I packed the photo of my original lab team. I packed my lucky mug. I packed the drive with the raw data, slipping it into my pocket. I was resigning. I was walking away from the deal, from the 6 months, from the proximity that had almost destroyed me. Jane didn't call security. She didn't order me to stop. She just stood there, behind her fortress of glass, watching me dismantle our partnership. The silence in the room wasn't empty anymore. It was screaming. It was screaming with everything she wasn't saying, with the choice she had made, and with the devastating regret radiating off her like heat. I walked to the door, box in hand. I paused, my hand on the handle, waiting for her to say something, anything, to stop me. "Goodbye, Jane," I whispered. She said nothing. The door clicked shut behind me, severing the connection, leaving her alone with her billions and her empty, perfect victory. My apartment was a sanctuary of exposed brick and warm filament bulbs, located in the Navy Yard, miles away from the sterile glass needle of Sterling Corp. It smelled of dried sage, old paper, and the rain that was currently hammering against the skylights with a violence that drowned out the city. I sat on the worn velvet sofa, staring at the unlit fireplace, my hands still trembling from the adrenaline of the walkout. I hadn't turned on the lights. I wanted the dark. I wanted the silence. I wanted to scrub the scent of antiseptic and cold ambition from my skin. Then came the knock. It wasn't the polite rap of a delivery. It was heavy, hesitant, human. I knew before I opened the door who was standing on the other side. But I wasn't prepared for the reality of her. Jane stood in the hallway, soaked to the bone. The water dripped from the hem of her trench coat, pooling on the concrete floor. She looked undone. The severe bun was gone, her dark hair plastered to her neck in wet, chaotic strands. The armor of the CEO, the tailored lines, the perfect posture, the icy distance, had been washed away by the storm. She looked smaller. She looked stripped. She looked like a woman who had walked all the way here because she had nowhere else to go. She didn't have an umbrella. She didn't have her security detail. She just had eyes that were wide, red-rimmed, and terrified. "You shouldn't be here, Jane," I said, though I didn't move to close the door. "I know," she whispered. Her voice was rough, lacking its usual polish. I didn't know where else to go. The office, it was too quiet without the noise of you fighting me. I stepped back. It was an instinct I couldn't kill. I let her in. The air in the apartment changed the moment she crossed the threshold. It became charged, heavy with the scent of rain and the undeniable pull of her presence. She stood by the kitchen island, shivering, while I put the kettle on. The domesticity of it felt dangerous. Making tea for the woman who had just ordered the destruction of my life's work felt like a surrender, but I couldn't leave her shivering in the dark. I handed her a mug. She wrapped her hands around it, her knuckles white, her fingers brushing mine. Her skin was ice cold. The contact sent a jolt through me that had nothing to do with static and everything to do with the terrifying fact that I still wanted her here. She didn't drink. She just stared into the steam. I hate it, she confessed, the words falling softly into the quiet room. I hate the decision. I hate the board. And God, Aspen, I hate who I have to become to please them. I stood there after you left and I realized I don't recognize myself in the reflection of that window anymore. I sat beside her on the sofa, close. The cushion dipped under our weight, tilting us together. Then why do it? Because I thought power was the only way to protect things, she said, turning to face me. The gray eyes were open, raw, unflinching. I thought if I owned it, I could control it. But I can't control this. I can't control how much I need you to respect me. The deal, the merger, it means nothing if it destroys the science. And it means less than nothing if it destroys the connection with you. She reached out. Her hand came up to my face, her palm cupping my jaw, her thumb tracing the line of my cheekbone. It wasn't a tentative touch. It was desperate, claiming, tender. I want a way out, she whispered, her voice cracking on the edge of the admission. Not for the stock price, for us. The word hung there. Us. It was the first time she had acknowledged it. We weren't rivals. We weren't partners. We were something volatile and vital that couldn't exist in a boardroom. I covered her hand with mine. If we stop the launch, I said, my voice steady, we lose everything. They'll fire us, they'll sue us, we'll be ruined. Let them, Jane said. Her gaze dropped to my lips, then back up, burning. Let them take the empire. I'd rather burn it down with you than rule it alone. We formulated the plan in the warm yellow light of the kitchen. We wouldn't save the merger. We would save the truth. We would release the raw data, exposing the risks, tanking the stock, and poisoning the hostile takeover from the inside. It was professional suicide. It was madness. And as we sat there, knees touching, plotting our own destruction, I knew it was the only way to win. The elevator ride to the boardroom was silent, but it wasn't the heavy, suffocating silence of before. It was the calm before a detonation. We stood shoulder to shoulder, not touching, but the space between us vibrated with the shared knowledge of what we were about to do. Jane wasn't wearing her armor today. There was no severe bun, no sharp-shouldered jacket. She wore a simple white silk shirt, her hair loose, looking less like a CEO and more like a woman who had nothing left to hide. I held the drive in my pocket, the plastic warm against my palm. It contained the raw data, the jagged, ugly, beautiful truth that was about to cost us everything. When we walked into the boardroom, the atmosphere was suffocatingly celebratory. Champagne flutes were already set out on the side table. The chairman sat at the head of the long mahogany table, smiling like a man who had just devoured a very expensive meal. He expected a coronation. He expected Jane to announce the launch, to spike the stock price, to validate his greed. He looked at us, his eyes sliding over me with dismissal, landing on Jane with possessive pride. "Jane," he boomed, gesturing to the podium. "The market is waiting. Give us the good news." Jane walked to the front of the room. She didn't look at him. She didn't look at the 30 board members staring at her with hungry eyes. She looked at me. A single, steadying glance that anchored her to the earth. Then she plugged in the drive. The screen behind her flickered. The sanitized, marketing-approved slides vanished, replaced by my chaotic, handwritten graphs and the stark, red-lined mortality projections. A murmur rippled through the room, confused and low, like the sound of insects before a storm. "The data you have been given is incomplete," Jane said. Her voice wasn't loud, but it cut through the room with the precision of a scalpel. "The product you are about to launch is not a cure." "Jane, what is this?" the chairman asked, his smile faltering. "It is a poison," she continued, clicking the remote. The simulation results flashed up. Cytokine storms, organ failure, death. The red lines spiked violently into the danger zone. "If we launch this week, we will not save patients. We will kill them. And the liability will bury this company within a fiscal quarter." The chairman stood up, his face turning a violent shade of purple. "Cut the feed!" he screamed, slamming his hand on the table. "Security! Cut the mic!" But Jane didn't stop. She looked directly into the camera, broadcasting to the shareholders. "I am releasing the full safety protocols to the FDA and the press as we speak. Sterling Corp is knowingly bypassing safety regulations for profit. The merger is built on a lie." It was instantaneous. The phones started ringing. All of them. A cacophony of digital chirps and vibrations that sounded like a swarm of locusts descending on a field. I watched the stock ticker on the side monitor. It hesitated for a heartbeat, then plunged. It was a free fall. Billions of dollars of valuation evaporating in seconds, turned to ash by the truth. The graph plummeted like a stone dropped in deep water, dragging the hostile takeover down with it. The room erupted. Lawyers shouted into phones, directors threw papers, and the chairman screamed for security, veins bulging in his neck. The sound of an empire crumbling is louder than you think. It sounds like desperate men realizing they are no longer rich. It sounds like panic. In the center of the storm, Jane stood perfectly still. She looked at me across the chaos of shouting suits and ringing phones. There was no regret in her eyes, no fear. There was only a profound, devastating relief. She had detonated her career, her reputation, and her legacy. She had burned it all down. And in the ashes, she looked at me with a gaze that was stripped of all corporate pretense. It was a look of total devastation and absolute freedom. Security burst through the doors. 2 large men in dark suits who didn't care about gene editing or moral compasses. They grabbed Jane by the arm. She didn't resist. She didn't flinch. She just kept looking at me as they moved toward me, too. "Miss Sterling, you're to be escorted from the premises immediately," the guard barked, his grip tight on her arm. "I know the way," she said, her voice calm, icy, regal even in ruin. We walked out. Not as executives, not as scientists. We walked out as pariahs. The lobby was a blur of staring faces, employees whispering behind hands, the news already breaking on the screens above the reception desk. We were fired. We were disgraced. We were utterly ruined in the industry. The glass doors slid open, and the humid city air hit us, smelling of exhaust and freedom. The door clicked shut behind us. There was no going back now. 3 weeks later, the dust was still settling, but it settled somewhere far away from us. We were sitting on a weathered wooden bench in a small park near the river, the kind of place where people walk dogs and ignored the collapse of biotech empires. The wind coming off the water smelled of salt and decaying leaves, a sharp contrast to the filtered, expensive air we had breathed for 6 months. My phone was in my pocket, silent. It had stopped ringing after the 3rd day of legal threats, replaced by the deafening silence of a contact list that had ghosted us en masse. Now, the only sound was the rustle of the newspaper Jane was pretending to read, and the distant hum of traffic that felt like a memory of a life we no longer live. We were pariahs. The industry had blacklisted us with a speed that was almost impressive. The lawsuits were pending, a mountain of paperwork that would likely take years to climb. My lab was gone, seized by the receivers. Jane's corner office was occupied by an interim CEO who probably didn't know the difference between RNA and a spreadsheet. We had lost the labs, the funding, the titles, and the prestige. We were no longer rival CEOs. We were just 2 brilliant, unemployed women sitting on a bench with cooling coffees in paper cups. And I had never seen Jane look more beautiful. She wasn't wearing the armor anymore. No tailored blazer, no silk blouse that cost more than my rent. She wore a thick, oversized wool sweater and jeans. Her hair was pulled back loosely, strands escaping in the wind. She looked younger. She looked lighter, as if the weight of the billions she had lost was actually a physical burden she had finally set down. She lowered the newspaper, folding it with that familiar precision that she couldn't quite unlearn. "My lawyer thinks they'll settle," she said, her voice conversational, as if discussing the weather. "They don't want the discovery phase. They don't want the emails coming out." "We're broke, Jane," I reminded her, taking a sip of the bitter coffee. "Settling just means we don't go to prison. It doesn't give us the science back." "We have the science," she corrected, tapping her temple. They took the equipment. They didn't take the minds. She turned on the bench to face me, tucking one leg under the other. The movement was casual, intimate in a way that still made my heart stutter. The tension of the office, that sharp, electric, dangerous pull, had softened into something steadier. It wasn't the frantic energy of forbidden lovers anymore. It was the grounded warmth of partners who had survived the crash. "Do you regret it?" I asked. It was the question that had been haunting me since we walked out of those glass doors. "You built that company for 10 years. You were the queen of the skyline. Now you're sitting on a park bench with a woman who ruined you." Jane looked at me. She didn't answer immediately. She looked at the river, then back at my face, studying me with that unflinching gray gaze. But the ice was gone. "I didn't build a company, Aspen. I built a cage. I spent 10 years convincing myself that if the walls were expensive enough, I wouldn't mind being trapped." She reached out, her hand covering mine on the rough wood of the bench. Her skin was warm. "I'm not ruined. I'm free. And I'm with the only person who was brave enough to hand me the match." She smiled then. It wasn't the shark-like smile of the boardroom or the polite smile of the gala. It was genuine, unguarded, and reached her eyes. It was a smile that belonged only to me. I turned my hand over, interlacing our fingers. There was no static shock this time, no warning jolt. Just the steady, reassuring pressure of her grip. It was the anchor I hadn't realized I was looking for until the storm washed me up here. "So, what now?" I asked. "We can't work in biotech. We're radioactive." "We start small," she said, her thumb brushing my knuckles. "A garage, a basement. We go back to the beginning. No board, no investors, no quarterly targets. Just the data. Just the truth. And us," I added softly. "And us," she affirmed. "The deal is dead, Aspen, but the proximity, I intend for that to be permanent." The wind picked up, scattering leaves around our feet, but neither of us moved to leave. We sat there, hand in hand, watching the river flow. Two architects of their own destruction who had managed to build something far more durable from the wreckage. The sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the path as we finally stood up. We walked away from the city center, away from the glass towers and the ambition, our shoulders brushing with every step. We weren't hiding anymore. We had traded an empire for integrity and a fortune for a touch that felt like coming home. If you believe some things are worth burning an empire for, subscribe for more stories of high stakes and higher passions.